Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Joining me today is Dr. Ray Gorman. Ray and I are going to be discussing kind of the current state and the evolution of physical therapy, where we're at now, how we got here, and where we think the future direction is going, especially as it relates to performance physical therapy or the PT care of athletes and active individuals. Really great episode with great insights for everyone. I know you're going to love this one. Before we get to it, though, make sure you check out our Season 5 sponsor, ISOFIT, my go-to for all things isometric strength training. You can check them out in the description below. Enjoy. Ray, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. Thank you so much for your time and for being here.
Dan, thank you for having me and sharing me with your audience.
Yeah, for sure. I got to give a quick shout out to Megan there. She
Yeah.
mentioned you when I last worked with her, and I'm really thankful that we were able to get connected and get this set up. You seem like an amazing individual doing so many great things, but maybe there's someone out there who isn't familiar with you. Would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the great things you do day in and day out?
Yeah, man, I appreciate that. My name is Dr. Ray Gorman. I'm a physical therapist and strength and conditioning coach. My journey started like many other PTs out there. I was actually working at a physical therapy clinic, always knew I wanted to go into like the medical field, but didn't really have the dedication at 18 years old to commit to like a 10-year plan of med school. So went the PT route. In that time, I actually ended up tearing my ACL and got to see it from the patient side, which was kind of like a blessing in disguise, right? Like you don't really know what you're going through or how it's going to shape you in the moment. But not only as a clinician, but also like with where I am today and seeing some of the problems that I was experiencing as a patient. I graduated PT school in 2014 and practiced clinically for about 5 years, kind of went right into the traditional outpatient realm. I never really worked in like a mill style clinic, right? I always worked in moderate volume clinics, which also kind of came along with, moderate salaries, but that's the trade that you kind of make. And about a year into my journey, I realized that like I just wasn't working with the patient population that I really wanted to. I wasn't working with the clients that I wanted to, and that led me to starting my cash-based clinic in a gym. And that was really a big starting point for me from an in-person perspective. And then ultimately I started working with a company where everything we did was online. And what ended up happening was I saw the limitations of both models and I figured, well, what if I blended those together? And that's kind of what's led me here today with my company, Engage Movement, where we help other physical therapists kind of do exactly that, implement a model that doesn't really require them to trade time for money.
Yeah, I think you bring up so many amazing points there, Ray. First off, from your own background and backstory, always kind of knowing that you wanted to be in the medical field, but not really knowing how you wanted to be involved. I think it's
Yeah.
interesting that you bring up, you were on the patient side and the clinician side in the sense that
Yeah.
you tore your ACL. You also mentioned that there's actually some trouble in paradise in the PT world, and never, not everything is sunshine and rainbows. And I can't wait to get into all of that and more
Yeah.
with you today. Just kind of unpacking that a little bit. First off, I think a lot of people I talk with, patients, doctors, PTs, and so on, everyone kind of has this general consensus that the normal for PT right now just isn't working for anyone. Would you
Yeah.
mind kind of filling us in a little bit about kind of the background of PT and how we got to where we are today and how we're stuck in this, what seems like a system that doesn't really actually get people to where they want to go?
Yeah, I think that the PT realm gets a bad rap, right? We talk about traditional physical therapy, insurances, all these things. I actually think that the physical therapy realm in the traditional sense of how it's set up is actually built very well for the consumer that it is actually meant to target, right? And you see this with a lot of like the mantras that we have in the physical therapy space, movement is medicine. How many people out there in the world are not hitting their movement standards, from a physical activity standpoint from the week? And so what we've kind of done is we've designed a system that was meant to almost capture that audience, put them in a physical location, make them do those things. Where I think the model really starts to do consumers wrong is when we try to put people that, from a training IQ level, from a physical preparedness level, are maybe a little bit above what that clinic is actually designed to uh, pull from them for a rehab or return to sport potential. And we're trying to put all the consumers into one box, right? And now you've kind of seen this lateralization of like people saying, well, look, I'm not just a physical therapist, I'm a performance therapist. And what that's really started to mean is like my clinic should look different. My thought process should look different. My ideal client is different, right? They don't do well in the traditional model. They need a little bit more loading. They need a little bit more autonomy. They need to be able to do things on their own. And so that's kind of one of the biggest things that I think I've seen transitionally in the profession.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you bring up. And going off of that, it's interesting how, for the majority of people, even some basic 3 sets of 10 stuff is more activity than they get on the
Ex
day to day, which
10 minutes on the bike, right? That's great
it's
for them.
yeah, it's groundbreaking and earth-shattering to most of us to hear that and think
Yeah.
that's the most exercise someone's getting that day.
Yeah.
But there are people out there that is their activity for the day, for the week, and that's the only
Yep.
thing that gets them moving. So I think it is important, to your point, to recognize that we almost have a larger problem as a country in the state of health and physical activity. And for the majority of people that fall under that category, general PT is a lot better than nothing.
For sure. And look, like my role isn't to try and revitalize the entire PT industry, right? My what I'm looking to do is to keep great providers who feel like they don't fit in the industry, who feel like the way that it's built for them. The role of the company is really to make sure that there's a space for them to succeed, that there's a space for them to evolve professionally, to evolve financially, to grow as a person. And if the role isn't there, you've got to build it yourself, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, when opportunity doesn't knock, you have to build your own door.
Yes.
And that's essentially where I see the performance PT coming in, as you mentioned before, is,
Yeah.
in the traditional model, like I think about most outpatient clinics I've seen, and, most don't really have anything above a 10 or 20 pound weight, which
Yeah.
again, for a lot of people, that's all they need.
Yeah.
But for I'll say the more fit populations or performance populations. I'm thinking about your middle school, your high school, your college athletes, your weekend warriors.
Hmm.
And I've seen them, I don't really put an age on that. Like I've seen
Yeah.
guys 50, 60, 70 years old who are stronger and more physically capable than people half their age. I just think that maybe we need to have a setting that actually fits them a little bit more.
Well, and when you're working with that population, right? My second job was in Division I athletics at the University of Nevada. And when you're working with that population, what's really happening is you're more coming in as a consultant, right? You're more coming in as a guide. You're more saying, like, hey, when you're in the weight room with the strength coaches, when you're on the track with the track and field coaches, when you're working with the athletic trainers, here's kind of the concepts that you need to operate within. Here's the parameters that you need to operate within. And so we come in this kind of more consultancy role, right? Now, here comes the problem is if my role is to be a consultant from one visit to the next, and I'm only going to see that person at 2, 3 points in time while they're going and executing the plan, that gives me a really low lifetime value from a business perspective, right?
Right.
So what's happening is we've constructed that model in such a way that we are giving away such immense value, and we are the ones who actually suffer from that financially. right?
Right.
So the model that we've kind of created is, how do you actually get reimbursed? How do you actually get compensated for that more consultancy role throughout the rehab spectrum with your client as you take them from rehab and return them back to performance?
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting way to look at it because you're essentially acknowledging, like, hey, the individual in front of me is extremely motivated. They want to get
Mhm.
better. They have the capacity to do so, the equipment to do so. They just need almost like someone to act as a GPS and guide them along the journey in a way.
And you bring up a really good point of the motivating factor, right? One of the pivotal moments in my career was when I was doing my student rotations. I actually loved inpatient rehab. Now, I loved the setting. I didn't necessarily love the type of knowledge that I was going to accumulate throughout my career. And so that was kind of what steered me away from that into the outpatient realm. But when I looked back on it kind of introspectively, it was like, what did I really like about that setting? Every single one of my patients wanted to get out of the hospital. Every single one, right? They wanted to go home. They were working so hard day in, day out in each setting. When we go into the traditional outpatient realm, there's a very different psych, psychology between the insurance-based consumer. I'm talking sometimes in the general sense, right? Not every insurance-based consumer, but in just kind of that traditional sense versus the cash consumer. In a lot of instances, the people who are coming in, they're there because they're told that's where they need to be. That's just the next stop in the journey for them. And look, if I get some hate for this, I get it. I know that that's not every person out there, but that is the way that the system is designed, right? Go to PT, 6 visits. If things don't get better, we'll write you an order for an MRI. Go to PT, 10 visits. If things don't get better, then you can have surgery. And I remember one time being in the clinic and somebody was like, hey, can you see me 6 days in a row so I can get my MRI? Right? Like, that was just like a very frustrating position to be in. When we move over into the cash realm, you have this motivated consumer that something has been taken away from them. And it's extremely important for them, for whatever deeper reason, to get back to it. Like, that's one of the biggest differences, I think, in satisfaction of my role, of my job when I did transition into the cash-based realm, is I kind of got back to my roots of like, you have a goal that you're looking to get to, let's help get you there.
Yeah, exactly. I love that point. And going off of it as well, I find that a lot of patients who fall under that original model that you proposed, where, they're sent to PT almost as a way to justify getting an MRI,
Hmm.
they end up in a real slippery slope or downward spiral, for lack of a better way to put it. A lot of times they do some PT, they don't really expect things to get better and
Great point.
don't get better. And I
Yeah.
think that the mental side of this is extremely important, in the sense that if you don't think you're going to get better, you're probably right. You're probably not going to get better. On top of that, if you do get that MRI, which there are times when that is essential, I literally just advocated earlier today for someone to get an MRI
Hmm.
because
Of
I was
course.
concerned about what I saw on exam with their knee. There are times and a place for that. That's why we have that technology. That's why we use it. And I push for it sometimes. But there's other times where we probably don't need to push for those MRIs. There's a few studies that I really like to educate my patients on. One of them in particular comes from a group in I think it was the British Medical Journal in 2012, where they did MRIs on people with knee pain,
Hmm.
and they looked at the reports, and they found that in 77% of the people who had pain, they had osteophyte formation in the joint,
Hmm.
which, okay, that's there, but in 72% that didn't have pain, they had osteophyte formation.
Hmm.
So we can't really just hang our hat on what MRIs show us every time. And sometimes
Of
maybe
course.
maybe we should actually focus on what we can do to improve our physical function, instead of just relying on, the picture to tell us what's wrong. Maybe instead we can kind of shift our framework off of the structure and more to the function, for lack of a better way to put it.
Well, there's two things there, right? That I want to share. There is also another article out. I'm the worst at this, right? But it was basically saying like one of the highest predictors of a positive outcome is belief that the outcome will work. Like that's not just an opinion, like that concept has been studied. So if you go into PT saying this isn't going to work, you're already putting yourself behind the eight ball. The second thing is I just think PT has a really bad branding reputation, right? Like I don't think people actually know what we do. I don't think people understand that our role as a profession is restoring function, not just helping you overcome injury. And so I think that that's why people are like, well, look, I don't just want to go there to get stretched and get massaged. I mean, maybe a lot of clients would like that. Maybe we'd actually do better if we were marketing ourselves like a stretch lab, right? But I think that it's part of our job as a profession. And I don't really think that where the professional organization has spent their money has done a really good job educating society of what PT actually does.
Well, I love that point. And the thing is, if you ask 10 different PTs what they do, you're going to get 10 different answers,
Right.
right? Like we can't even agree
Right.
on what we do.
Right.
And I think everything exists on a spectrum. And I think there's some PTs who are basically just trying to be strength coaches. And I think
Mhm.
there's other PTs that still live in what I call the 1970s era of PT, where it's hot pack ultrasound and massage every day.
Sure.
So I think everything's on a continuum. And I think that the best answer is probably somewhere in the middle most of the
Yeah.
time for most
Agreed.
people. But I think to your point, we need to establish what it is we actually do. And I've heard the phrase transforming society by optimizing human movement, but if we're going to claim to do that, we should probably actually understand human movement and not just, throw a hot pack on it and rub
Yeah.
someone for 20 minutes and
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think that there's got to be some sort of delineation a little bit more in the profession of, the settings and what we call ourselves. And that's why I think you see people kind of moving away from the name physical therapist, right? You see them trying to get a little bit more creative so that there is some unique factor that actually allows them to stand out. Against the grain of the profession's identity as a whole.
yeah. No, I completely agree. And going back to some things that you mentioned earlier about, the patient belief in success and even your own rehab experience to a certain extent, ultimately the patients that we work with get put with a lot of input, right? Cognitive,
Hmm.
emotional, following an injury or following restriction from what they want to do, sensory. There's so many different things that go into the patient. And we kind of see it as a manifestation of pain or stress or changes in how someone moves. But I think in order to like look at someone clinically and how they present to us from that pain or motor standpoint, we also need to be able to backtrack and look at all of the things that went into getting them there. And I think that's another
Yeah,
area
100%.
I think that's another area where you kind of mentioned before the consultant type role. I think that really shines here because you can actually take a step back and say, hey, let's look at all of the things going into this, right? Let's not just measure your knee range of motion, but let's look at how you're sleeping lately, what's been going on in your personal life and so much and so on from there. And I'm willing to bet that that was not the case in your own rehab experience.
Yeah. And I also think that you brought up the point that essentially like something I always tell the people that we work with, right, is like context matters.
Right.
Context is the most important variable in the rehab spectrum of figuring out where on that continuum you actually are, because we've, again, this comes back to some of the mantras that I think we've kind of clung on to as a profession. Movement is medicine. Very true for the consumer that doesn't move a lot, but for my consumer, the number one problem that they had was too much of that, right? Just load it, bro. Again, really good message for somebody who never loads their tendon. For my performance consumer, generally it was an overload issue, right? So like never rest. Like we're not going to rest. The number one thing that I would tell my clients to do is like, hey, what if you just chilled out on your shoulder for like 2, 3 days? Let's circle back on Monday and see if it's better, and then just like reintroduce that. So it's just like the context part of it is such a key variable. And I think when we can get PTs and even strength and conditioning coaches operating with a little bit of consistency within their system, not just for their sake, but so that they can actually explain to the client like what is going on, right? So we have three main presentations that we teach all of our clients in our program that is essentially the summary of findings, right? We call that the client attribute profile. It essentially says, how are you built, right? A tank has different attributes than a motorcycle. They're used very differently for different reasons. The next would be stress capacity. So, how do things external to the things that you're doing from a physical activity standpoint, the things that you're doing from a training standpoint, how do those things affect your capacity to handle stress? Right? What are the external factors? Was work really hard that day? Was traffic really bad? Have your kids been crazy? And then you're going to go into the gym and do an open workout on 5 hours of sleep? Like, it's not just the open workout, right? It's the combination of those things. And then lastly, we do a big presentation on return to sport, return to activity. Because in general, PT is perceived as being done when the problem of pain is solved. And at that moment, the consumer's brain is saying, I'm done, and value starts to drop. But the reality is, we're just moving into a next phase, which we call reconditioning. And now the problem of that phase is the injured tissue feels good, but it is not at the capacity that the rest of the body is able to push. And that's how you get this chronic cycle of re-injury. People feel good, they push really hard. People feel bad, they go back down, and that cycle continues. And when we install a virtual offer, what we call the prescriptive exercise program, we literally solve that problem like no other traditional mechanism can.
I love that you brought up first and foremost the context piece because I think that's essential and I think it's often missed. And I think that really gives the people you're working with a lot of closure, right? A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people, when they get injured or they get hurt, they start asking, why did this happen to me? What did I do?
Yeah.
And a lot of
What
times,
can I do to make it never happen again?
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think being able to step back and look at the full picture actually allows you to do that. You know, I tell a lot of the people that I work with, in fact, I've told everyone in the past few months, my little saying is when they leave, I don't want them to come back for the same thing ever again,
Yeah.
right? Like if I rehab your ACL and I take a full 12 months to do it, if you come back to me in a year and you retore your ACL, I might not have done my job appropriately or properly. I might have missed something. You know, there's a certain time and place where some things just can't be avoided, right? Like if you're a
Sure.
football player and
Sure.
some 250-pound linebacker decides to drive his helmet through your knee, I can't really prevent that.
Right.
But there's a lot that we can prevent. And I don't want people coming back to me with the same issue over and over and over again, that cycle that you outlined. And I think it's essential to your point, to almost empower or equip the people that we work with the ability to manage these things on their own. I don't think we have a system right now that focuses on independent autonomy. I think if anything, we
Exactly.
rely on dependence of others. And I want
Yeah.
to break that mold myself. I don't like people feeling like they have to come see me for certain things. I want them to feel like, hey, you know, Dan gave me these things before. I know what to do and I can handle it and it gets better on its own. You know, I think that we all need to be happy and readily available to help people. But I also think that if we keep seeing the same person for the same thing over and over and over again, at some point we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing wrong and what could we do better and how could we better provide for them?
I like to think about it like this, right? The model is actually backwards of how it needs to be. So when it is not uncommon that our model, the amount of sessions generally tapers off as somebody is starting to feel better, right?
Mhm.
Like that's just super common with what we see. That's the way that it goes. But we know that from the research to accumulate a chronic workload, a protective workload, what actually needs to happen is the amount of touch points should be going up because now we're blending that spectrum of rehab into performance. And we really should be accumulating workload over 3, 4, 5 days, not one session every week, every 2 weeks, every month, right?
Right.
Now, if you're in the cash space, asking somebody to come in for $150 a session, $200 a session, 3, 4 times a week, it doesn't fit where their psychology of the problem actually is because they feel like I'm out of pain. Why would I keep coming in? And again, that is the thing that having a virtual offer, that prescriptive exercise program that goes beyond your clinic walls can allow you to come in as a coach, can allow you to come in as a consultant and replicate those touch points at the moment your client actually needs them with more autonomous support than they would actually be getting in the clinic.
I completely agree. You keep bringing up the prescriptive exercise programming model, and I think that it's essential to have that piece. But I've noticed, at least for myself, when I was in grad school, and I don't want to be the one who throws a stone at a glass house, for lack of a better way to put it, but progressive exercise was not really a focus in the educational system from a PT school standpoint.
Right.
So how do you suggest, or how do your clinicians that you work with go about, gaining additional knowledge and experience on that front and then apply it to the clients that they're serving? Because it's a little bit more difficult when you're not seeing the person day in and day out like you're used to.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, right? I think I was ahead of the curve with that because I had been a coach, right? I had started coaching in 2009. I kind of got heavily into CrossFit in 2008, and I love experimenting with myself. So I went through probably every strength building cycle out there, Wendler, conjugate, German volume training, endurance training, like if there was something out there that I could experiment with and see how it affected me, I went through that. The biggest thing I think is if you want to be in this realm, we as a profession, I think, have an overconsumption issue with education and under implementation. And I think that's because we have been conditioned to think so conservatively, right? We're always looking at worst case scenario for everything. We're always thinking do no harm first, right? And so how do you make sure that you do no harm? You rein everything back in. And if you've never actually experienced these things, it's really hard for you to figure out how is it going to adapt for your client. So for me, it's like, how do I understand these different variables? How do I know if somebody should be on a 7-day adaptation cycle, a 10-day adaptation cycle, in some cases, a 14-day adaptation cycle, right? The only way that I knew that was by messing up, by programming people who should have been on a 14-day cycle on a 7-day cycle and saying, what variable can I actually manipulate here? And that's one of them. So work with a coach, go lift weights, right? Get in the gym and see what an exercise feels like. Um, Elbows used to be the hardest thing for me to rehab until I had my own elbow injury, right? Like, so there's so much that you can learn using yourself as an experiment in this really like safe, laboratory condition of the gym.
Yeah, I love that point, and I cannot echo that enough. I mean, backtracking here, I think I need you to say the point about over consuming education, but under
Yeah.
implementing it a little bit louder, because I've seen that over and over and over again. It
Yeah.
seems like everyone is always sharing the latest and greatest research, but no one's actually doing anything different because of it. And the point of research and scientific knowledge, I believe, is to move the needle forward. So if we learn something, but then don't implement it, we're ultimately doing the person in front of us a disservice by not providing them what we know to be the best possible option. And I think to a certain extent, we're never going to have all the answers through research alone. I continue to find more and more that the most effective clinicians, in my personal opinion, are the ones who are out there in the trenches doing it like their patients do it, whether that's the
Yep.
CrossFit workouts, the marathons, the
Yep.
the more physical events like that that their patients are doing. They do those things themselves. They know
Yep.
what it's like to be in those conditions, and they faced a lot of the same issues themselves. To your point, a lot of runners I've talked with in the past, they get shin splints or the knee pain and that sort of thing, and they become really good at treating those things.
Yeah.
Or likewise, maybe someone, to your point, elbow pain. You mentioned a past ACL surgery. I'd be willing to bet that you're pretty good at rehabbing those because you've gone through it yourself. And I think there's something to be said about that. And I love your point on self-experimentation as well. I will say sometimes bad things happen when we do that. I've made a few mistakes myself. I kind of destroyed my back last summer, and I messed up my pec at one point. But that's how we live and learn. And ultimately, we have to be willing to accept a little risk reward. And we also have to learn ourselves, like, hey, okay, maybe that was too much load, or maybe that wasn't the most best position that I could have been in for that exercise. Now I'm going to take that and apply that to my patient because I don't know about you,
Yeah.
Ray, but I'd rather myself get injured when I'm working on myself than a patient get injured when I'm working with them. So,
Well, a concept that I always talk about is, and I used to see this a lot when I was working in Division I athletics, was everybody is constantly searching for the ceiling, right? It felt good, do another set. It felt good, run faster until you blow up.
yeah,
What we really teach is our job is helping you reestablish a floor. And so what that allows us to do is it lets us know what's the amount of work that you can tolerate before we take the next leg up. And in reality, like rehab is a lot like the stock market, right? We have these peaks, we have these healthy pullbacks, we have these next leg up. And then as we pull back, we don't pull back to the bottom. I mean, like keep in mind we're talking on a bull run here, right? We're talking when it's going up. We pull back to our new floor being that old peak. And then
hmm
the cycle continues. Now, if your client spikes too fast, yeah, they will pull all the way back to that old floor because they didn't have enough capacity to maintain the volume that they were working with, to maintain the things that they were working with. So I think that that can be just another key component when somebody is looking into kind of more the rehab spectrum. Um, and on the implementation front, like the reason I love working with physical therapists is because the concept of business are so close to rehab, so close to strength training that like you don't get strong by reading about strength training. You get strong by being in the gym. You don't get good at sales by reading about sales. You get good at sales by having more sales conversations. You don't get good at networking by reading about networking. You go and network, right? Like it's the same concept.
yep. And to that point, just as important as actually doing the thing is, I found, at least for myself in my limited experience, it's also just as important to take time afterwards, step back and actually reflect on it, right? If you want
100%.
to go into the sales route, well, how did that sales meeting go? What did I do well? What did I not do well? What can I do differently next time? Same
Mhm.
thing from a rehab or performance training standpoint. What went well? What didn't go well? What can I do to
Yep.
adjust next time? I think the more that you take those steps back and self-reflect on things, the more effective you become at whatever it is you're trying to do.
I used to be pretty terrified of sales, like a lot of other people out there. And the first time I implemented new process, it was scary. I was shaking, right? Like, because you don't know what to expect. But the more that you do something, the more you know what to expect, right? And the more that you understand the variable outcomes that are possible, and the less scary the things become, right? And I think that the same is said for those, I know that we've kind of talked a little bit about entrepreneurship in the beginning, but the same is said for those like looking to venture into entrepreneurship, right? The people love the idea of it, but it's scary because there's so many variables of unknown. But one thing that I found is the more that I do it, the less scary it gets. The more that I understand what it means when this thing happens in my business, the less I freak out when something goes wrong that's out of my control. And so again, if you can create those parallels for your clients, for for other therapists that you work with, like you can start to see that like all this stuff follows a very similar pattern.
It does. It does. It's interesting to see those overlaps, and I think that's one of the many things that makes exercise and what we do on the day to day so powerful and impactful for people, right? Like the
Yeah.
carryover, the lessons you learn. I always go right to delayed gratification, and that
Yeah.
goes across the board with all of the things you just touched on. In particular, entrepreneurship, right? It does not occur overnight, right? You don't just
Right.
open a business and become a millionaire in a day. And on top of that, I'll take that a step further. I'm going to make a bold claim. I think a lot of people, if you're starting a business, your goal should be, yes, we want to make money, but ultimately we want to provide better for people in front of us. And we want to do so in a capacity that fulfills ourselves.
Hmm.
And yes, financial outcomes can be a side effect of that, but our goal should not be to get filthy freaking rich doing that, as the main goal. Our driver needs to be the people first, in my opinion. I don't think many people become PTs expecting to become millionaires, but I've found the more I've met people, the more I've been wrong about that.
Well, I also don't think we expected to graduate and earn 60 grand a year, right?
You're right about
So,
that.
so but I look at it like there's kind of three facets of business, right? There's businesses that are built to generate revenue and create wealth.
Hmm.
Okay. Um, the way that you structure your business, if you're going to be a solopreneur doing physical therapy, it's probably not going to be that one. There are businesses that are designed to make impact. And then there are businesses that are designed to suit your lifestyle. And the reality is, you've got to find a balance of the three so that you're able to create the thing that you want to create. But, if somebody comes to me and they've never made $10,000 a month and they say, well, within a year, I want to be at $100,000 a month. It's like, well, hold on, we got to pump back the expectation here. That'd be like saying you've never picked up a weight in your life and you want to go to the CrossFit Games, the Olympics, right? Like we've got to put into a little perspective about how much work would actually need to go into to get you there. Now, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, could you get there? Absolutely. But we've got to have realistic expectations and we've got to understand the microeconomics around the business model that we're in. And in PT and physical therapy, the microeconomics are very simple actually.
You were saying microeconomics, that's more in relation to the cash-based approach than the insurance-based approach as well,
E-
correct?
Even the insurance-based approach, right? Like the revenue generation system within the business is volume, price per visit, product type. There's really not much else that we manipulate. So if I'm a business that has low revenue contracts, I need to offset that by high volume visits. If I'm a cash clinic that is going to do low volume visits, I need to counter that by collecting enough per session and making sure that my lifetime value is big enough over time.
Right,
So
right.
when you boil that all down, and all of that is generally a fee for service, right? I come in, I pay, I do my thing. We structure our clients with packages for different reasons. But you've got to understand like what is kind of the realm that you're looking to create and how does your business work. As physical therapists, we have such a high value skill set once we actually figure out how to deliver that message that it can become, I don't want to say easy, but the volume metric of what is needed to replace your salary isn't actually that crazy, right? And
Right.
everyone talks about like, oh, well, you've got to now rent space and you got to take on all this overhead. Like if you set up your business lean, those things like don't really affect your bottom line that much. You can get creative with how you structure overhead. It doesn't cost you 150, $50,000, $100 to start a clinic like the business plan that you created in PT school, right? That's another big problem. My first clinic, I started for the cost of my LLCs and $50 for the table I bought. Like it wasn't really a high overhead, high capital business. So it's getting that message out there and just empowering people that like the thing that you want is available for the taking, but you have to be the one who puts in the work and takes the leap.
We were talking about that before we even got on this call, Ray, how, a lot of us, we compare our day one to someone else's day 1000
Yeah.
sometimes. And it's very easy, especially in today's day and age, to pull up the Instagram and see, someone who's got a beautiful 10,000 square foot clinic. They've got every machine you could ever imagine, and the thing probably cost $1 million. But
Yeah.
that's not realistically how they started, and that's probably not how you're going to start. You're probably going to start small and then build and scale over time. And sometimes that's what we have to do. We have to start with the bare bones and find a way to make it work and then go from there. To your point about microeconomics, I find it's a lot easier to justify buying things for the clinic when you have revenue coming in.
Of course.
It's not as easy to justify dropping, 20, 30 grand outfitting new equipment when you haven't even seen a single patient yet.
Sure.
So I certainly think that taking those extra steps and really ultimately just getting started and building momentum. I find a lot of people kind of snowball as they get in motion. They just need to
Of
remain in
course.
motion at that point. The hardest part is getting started. It becomes a
Yeah.
lot easier to add all those other facets on. And to your point too about the lean startup, I mean, there's literally a book that I love called The $100 Startup, and it's a
Yep.
collection of stories of people who literally made it on $100 budget. And it's
Yep.
like, if they can do it on $100, why can't you?
Yeah, and I hope more people take that message and take that leap, right? And understand that like these things are available. There are resources out there. Um, Look, I'll say this, and I mean it because I put my money where my mouth is. But like nothing helps me get to where I am faster than having the right type of support, having a coach in my business, right? I have multiple coaches who coach me on helping my business get to where I want it to get. And I think a lot of times like we get kind of stuck in this like I have to just grind it out, do it myself. This is the way it's supposed to be. I don't want to ask for help. And sometimes that ends up with people getting and staying stuck, right? And if we want to break out of that cycle, if we want a different result, we sometimes need to think differently. We sometimes need to reshape and challenge our current beliefs that allow us to push past that. So, I know that there's a lot of people out there who are on the fence of starting, and I hope that maybe that lends some encouragement to take that first step and go out there on your own.
Echoing off that point as well, I mean, I'm fortunate enough to have been taking those steps at a young age, but I know a lot of people listening, they might not be 26 years old and taking those steps. They might be
Sure.
30 or 40. They might have, a family or people that
Yeah.
depend on that income. And I think that there are ways to build up based on wherever you are right now before just jumping and taking the leap, and doing that almost makes that leap a little less scary, right? It's almost like you tested the depth of the river with a foot before you just jumped all the way in. But ultimately, to your point, you have to work with someone who's done that successfully in the past, or maybe you don't have to, but it's a lot easier if you do, right? Like I didn't design my own website because
Yeah.
it's not my specialty. I had someone design it for me, just like that person who designed my website they don't PT their family. They send
Right.
their family to me for PT. So, everyone has things that they're good at. And the more we kind of work together to make things happen, the better our outcome is going to be. And, again, to the point I made a second ago, the more you collaborate with other people, the less scary, you mentioned this earlier, the less scary that jump is. And the river you're going to jump into doesn't seem nearly as deep when you actually get in it.
Well, there's two proverbs or whatever you call those things, right? Like, but the first one is like, when's the best time to plant a tree? 10 years ago. But the second best time is today, right? Like we have to start.
Right.
The other one is like, beyond those mountains, there are more mountains. And from those two things, from those two stories, the lesson that I always pull is like, there's no better time to start than now, because when the event that's on the horizon for you is out of the way, there's going to be another event on the horizon. And when you wait for the next quarter to roll around, there's going to be things that monopolize your time, your energy, your resources, to then you push out to the next quarter. And I can't tell you how many people I've seen that have just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And then they look back and they say, like, man, I really wish I would have started this sooner. I really wish I would have just taken the leap. But like, it's always going to be scary. You're always going to have this like feeling of like, oh, I don't know. But that's typically where the most growth lies, because that feeling is a filter, right? That's literally what it is. That feeling is a filter of, are you willing to push beyond it to get what's on the other side without having all the certainty in the world that you're going to actually be able to get what you want from it.
Yeah, no, I love that point, Ray. Say someone's on the fence about that right now. How do you kind of motivate someone to, hey, make that change? Or, do they have to kind of find that motivation themselves? How do people go about almost having that motivation to make the leap and go into that entrepreneur type journey?
I mean, look, they definitely have to figure out what it is about it that's holding them back, right? Like, we are never going to pressure somebody into making a change. Like, this has to be your decision. Now, we can help you challenge why you're resistant to it, and we can help you look introspective to why you don't want to do it. But I think it's really the fact of like, if you were going to go skydiving, the only way that you get the rush is if you jump. And this experience is kind of the same thing. You're telling me you want the adrenaline rush. You're telling me you want the feeling of skydiving, but you're also saying, I don't want to jump. Well, you can't have both, right? Because you're safe on the plane. And so if you can push beyond that, if you can say, hey, this both feels uncomfortable, but I know I should do it, I think that's the thing that you have to balance. So I use kind of like the concept of growth, right? It's growth isn't about saying yes to everything. It's about understanding what to say yes to and what to say no to. So if something makes me uncomfortable and I say no to that experience, I've actually done myself a disservice. I've actually left myself in a period of regret. I wish I would have done it. If I say yes and push past that discomfort, I get the personal growth. Now, on the other side, if something is out of alignment and I take it for the wrong reason, I end up with regret. But if I say no in that scenario, I end up with my personal growth, right? That for a lot of people, that's setting boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah, I call it like FOMO versus JOMO, right? FOMO, fear of missing out. JOMO means joy of missing out, right?
Yes.
Sometimes
Yes.
we need to say yes to everything, or we feel we do, and we just have to be involved in it all because
Yeah.
we fear missing something. But sometimes there's a lot of joy that comes from missing one or two things to focus on the big picture.
Well, you look at why there's such a high rate of burnout in our profession. It's because we lack the ability to say no because we're fearful of the response, right? So what
Right.
do? We take on more work for maybe an incremental or no bump in pay, right? For the experience. We go work PRN and we say yes to shifts that we should have said no to. And then what happens? Monday comes around, and instead of feeling recharged, we're burnt out. So, because we don't have that boundary system, because we don't have a personal belief of what it means to actually sit back and recharge, we end up in this perpetual cycle of burnout. And like, look, I'm not a hustle and grind, build my business kind of person. I've lived that life before. I hated it. I understand the sacrifice for me of slowing down and enjoying my life is that my business doesn't grow at the rate that it could. I'm okay with that. I'll take that all day, right? Over being depressed and anxious and not being, able to communicate with my wife. Take that all day.
Right, right. It's just a matter of priorities, and I would imagine that those shift over time, right? Like there's a
100%.
season, there's a season of life to go all in and grow, and there's a season of life where it's time to slow down a little bit. And you kind of have to know when you're in what season and when it's time to throttle forward and when it's time to
Yeah.
pull back.
I had somebody that asked me, how do you learn boundaries? And by crossing them. Right? Like that's the reality. Like, how do you learn a boundary? By crossing them. How do you learn how far you could push your parents before you got in trouble? You got in trouble, right?
Yeah,
Like, and you knew that that was beyond the limit. So how do you do that in training? How do you push yourself physically? You maybe bonk out when you're in an endurance event, or you maybe miss a lift, right? You cross the boundary. So all those things really kind of translate into life, business, personal growth, personal development. And I just think that there's a lot of lessons in taking that leap and embracing the what was the quote? You don't deserve success until you can embrace the opportunity for failure.
yeah, I love that. I love that. Ray, I feel like we touched on so many amazing points throughout our conversation today. Is there anything that we missed or any kind of closing thoughts that you might have?
I mean, I think that was a pretty good one to end on, but if you're out there and you are concerned with the setup that you're in, you're unsure what to do, like my DMs are always open. I'm happy to kind of hear out your situation, help ask you questions that make you kind of challenge that process for yourself, and really help you figure out like what it is that you want, and find resources out there that can do similar, right? So, I'm an open book when it comes to stuff like that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, Ray. I was going to say for people who want to find out more about you and all the amazing things that you do to help people kind of escape what I think a lot of people refer to as the rat race of life,
Yeah.
where can they find you at?
My most active platform is Instagram. You can find me at Ray Gorman DPT. You can also, if you want to follow along and subscribe to our newsletter, you can head over to engagemovement.com, and you can check out our programs page where you can learn a little bit more about the performance provider growth model that kind of blends that in-person and virtual offer. So you don't have to be reliant on in-person sessions and generate a little bit of recurring revenue for your business.
For sure. We'll link to all of that in the description below as well. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there. Ray, really appreciate your time today, man. Thanks for being here.
Dan, thank you for having me on, man.